Blackwater Bay had always been a place of quiet beauty, a small coastal town where the rhythm of life was dictated by the tides. Generations of fishermen made their living off the bay's bountiful waters, and tourists flocked to its serene shores, drawn by the promise of tranquil vacations and the freshest seafood. But as summer waned into the chill of autumn, something in the town's atmosphere began to shift. An unsettling silence settled over the water, and with it came an inexplicable sense of foreboding. Evelyn Harris felt it the moment she arrived. As a marine biologist, she had spent her life studying the secrets of the sea, but this was different. The air itself seemed heavier, charged with an uneasy tension that made her skin prickle. She watched the horizon from the porch of her rented cottage, the sea a dark, endless expanse under the setting sun. The locals had warned her, albeit cryptically, that this was not the best time for her research. "The sea is sick," they'd say, eyes darting nervously toward the horizon. She brushed off their superstitions at first, chalking it up to the usual wariness of outsiders. But soon, even her scientific mind couldn't ignore the growing strangeness. Within days, reports began to circulate around town. Fishing boats were returning empty, their nets devoid of the usual haul. At first, it was dismissed as an anomaly, perhaps a shift in the currents or an early migration. But then the stories grew darker. Fishermen spoke of feeling watched, of shadows moving just beneath the surface, massive and silent. A chill would settle over their boats, an unnatural cold that left a lingering dread. No one dared venture out alone anymore, not after dusk. Evelyn took note of these accounts with growing concern. This was not mere overfishing or a seasonal change. Something was driving the life from the bay. Evelyn's curiosity turned to obsession. She spent hours in the town library, sifting through old maritime records and local folklore. The deeper she dug, the more she unearthed tales of a legendary creature that had haunted Blackwater Bay for centuries. A ghost shark that came in cycles, leaving death and emptiness in its wake. The older generations had spoken of it in hushed tones, recounting how every 100 years or so, the sea would fall silent and a darkness would spread from the depths. The stories were always the same: fishermen lost at sea, boats shattered and washed ashore, their crews never to be found. Skeptical but intrigued, Evelyn considered the possibility of an unknown predator or a previously undocumented natural phenomenon. But that didn't explain the fear etched into the faces of the people she interviewed. It was as if they believed the sea itself had turned against them. Caleb, one of the oldest fishermen in the bay, was the only one willing to talk openly. "It's not just a shark," he told her one stormy afternoon at the docks. His voice was low, his eyes fixed on the horizon. "It's the sea's spirit, angered and vengeful. You don't see it, you feel it. And when it comes for you, there's nothing you can do." Despite the growing apprehension, Evelyn decided to conduct a survey of the bay. She convinced Caleb and a few others to take her out on their boat, offering payment they couldn't refuse. As they sailed into the open water, the town grew small behind them, a distant speck on the edge of an infinite black sea. The day was unnaturally quiet. There were no seabirds, no splashes of fish breaking the surface, just an oppressive, eerie stillness. Hours passed with nothing to show for their efforts. Evelyn scanned the water with her equipment, but the sonar showed no signs of life. Even the currents seemed to avoid the area, leaving the boat adrift in a vast, empty void. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the deck, and a thick fog began to roll in from the east. Caleb muttered a prayer under his breath, his weathered hands gripping the wheel tightly. Then, just as the light began to fade, it happened. A loud, thunderous impact shook the boat, knocking everyone off their feet. Evelyn scrambled to her knees, her heart pounding in her chest. They peered over the edge, but there was nothing, just the dark, endless water staring back at them. The silence was broken by a scream. Caleb had fallen overboard, his body thrashing in the water as he was pulled under by an unseen force. The others rushed to the side, throwing a line, but it was too late. He was gone, the sea swallowing him whole with a final, ominous ripple. Evelyn stared in horror at the spot where Caleb had disappeared, her mind racing to make sense of what she had just witnessed. The boat rocked violently again, the water churning as a massive shadow passed beneath them. It moved with a predatory grace, circling them like a phantom. For a brief moment, Evelyn caught a glimpse of it, a pale, ghostly form that seemed to glow in the dark water, its eyes empty voids that pierced through the depths. It was gone as quickly as it had appeared, leaving behind an unsettling stillness. The crew managed to bring the boat back to shore, their faces ashen, their eyes hollow. No one spoke of what they had seen. They didn't need to. The entire town felt it when they returned, an unspoken understanding that something ancient and malevolent had awakened in their waters. The news of Caleb's death spread like wildfire, and fear took root in every corner of Blackwater Bay. Evelyn sat alone in her cottage that night, replaying the events over and over in her mind. This was no ordinary shark, no mere creature of the deep. It was something else, something that defied all logic and science. The townspeople were right. The sea was sick, but it was more than that. It was haunted. She felt a chill run down her spine as she gazed out the window at the moonlit bay, the water now an inky black that seemed to stretch into infinity. The ghost shark was real, and it was hunting. Evelyn Harris awoke with a start, her breath shallow, the memory of Caleb's screams still echoing in her ears. It had been 2 weeks since that night on the bay, but the terror lingered like a dark shadow over her thoughts. Sleep had become a fleeting visitor, and when it came, it was plagued by nightmares, visions of endless black waters, cold and hungry, pulling her down into an abyss where the ghost shark waited with its hollow eyes. It called to her in those dreams, its voice not one of sound but of sensation, a pull at the very edges of her sanity. The town of Blackwater Bay had changed as well. A heavy, pervasive dread hung over the streets. The once bustling docks were now eerily quiet. Boats lay moored, gathering dust, their owners refusing to venture out. The few fishermen who dared speak of the ghost shark did so in hushed tones, glancing nervously over their shoulders as if the sea itself were listening. Each day, Evelyn felt the eyes of the townsfolk on her. They blamed her in part for stirring up the darkness that now loomed over their lives. She became a pariah, whispered about in taverns and markets. They called her the Marked One, a harbinger of doom who had invited the wrath of the sea. Evelyn felt their fear closing in on her, tightening like a noose around her neck. Her scientific inquiry had opened a door to something far darker than she could comprehend, and now she was trapped on the other side. She threw herself into her research, desperately searching for answers that might explain the ghost shark, might rationalize the unthinkable. The more she learned, the more she felt herself slipping away from reality. Nights were the worst. The silence in her cottage was oppressive, broken only by the rhythmic crashing of the waves against the shore. It was as if the sea was trying to communicate with her, each wave a whisper in a language she couldn't understand. She began to see things, fleeting shadows in her periphery, the glint of pale eyes in the dark corners of her room. Once she awoke to find the floor of her bedroom soaked with seawater, the salty scent permeating the air, though her windows were tightly shut and the sea lay a good half-mile away. Evelyn tried to rationalize it, attributing it to stress and lack of sleep, but deep down she knew it was more. The ghost shark was not just a creature, it was a force, a presence that seeped into the minds of those who sought it. It fed on their fears, drawing them into its dark realm. She found herself drawn back to the bay every day, standing on the cliffs as if waiting for something, anything, to reveal itself from the depths. One evening, she visited the church, a small stone building on the edge of town, seeking some semblance of solace. Father Donnelly greeted her with a solemn nod, his eyes weary yet kind. "You've seen it," he stated, not as a question but as a grim acknowledgement. Evelyn nodded, unable to find her voice. The priest sighed, motioning for her to sit. "The sea holds many secrets, Miss Harris. Some are meant to remain hidden." He spoke of ancient beliefs, of the sea as a living entity, harboring both life and death within its endless depths. "The ghost shark," he explained, "is not just a beast. It is the embodiment of something older, something tied to the very soul of this town. Every century it rises, summoned by the darkness in our hearts." Evelyn shuddered at his words, the implication that the creature was not merely a predator, but a reflection of human sin and despair. The days grew shorter, the sun hidden behind a veil of gray clouds that seemed permanently affixed to the sky. Evelyn began to lose track of time. She stayed up late, poring over maps, journals, and anything she could find that might shed light on the nature of the ghost shark. She discovered accounts dating back to the early settlers of Blackwater Bay, stories of a monstrous specter of the sea that emerged during times of turmoil and suffering. The creature, it seemed, was drawn to the emotional decay of the town, feeding off the collective fear and guilt of its inhabitants. Evelyn became convinced that the key to stopping the shark lay not in killing it, but in understanding it. But as she delved deeper into the town's history, she found herself falling into a spiral of obsession. Her behavior grew erratic. She started hearing whispers at night, soft and indistinguishable, as if the sea were trying to tell her something. At first, they were just on the edge of hearing, but soon they became louder, more insistent. They filled her ears like the roaring of the tide, a cacophony of voices urging her to return to the water. The townsfolk noticed her decline. She had become gaunt, her eyes hollow and haunted. When she walked through town, people avoided her gaze, crossing the street to avoid passing too close. They whispered that she was becoming one of them, that the sea had marked her for its own. It was Caleb's widow who finally confronted her, a desperate plea in her eyes. "Leave, Evelyn," she begged. "Leave before it takes you too." But Evelyn could not leave. She was tethered to the mystery, bound by a need to uncover the truth, even if it meant her own demise. The line between reality and nightmare blurred. She began to hallucinate, or at least she thought they were hallucinations. She would catch glimpses of the shark's shadow moving beneath the surface as she stood on the cliffs, its massive form gliding just below the waves. In her sleep, she dreamt of drowning, the water filling her lungs as the ghost shark loomed above her, its hollow eyes watching with cold indifference. One particularly stormy night, Evelyn awoke to find her bedroom door wide open, a trail of wet footprints leading from the doorway to her bed. Her heart pounded as she followed the trail out to the beach. There, at the water's edge, stood a figure, vaguely human, yet not. It turned to her, its eyes empty voids like the shark's, its skin shimmering with an unnatural luminescence. Evelyn felt her knees buckle, an overwhelming wave of terror crashing over her. The figure raised an arm, pointing out to sea, and then it was gone, leaving only the crashing waves and the howling wind in its wake. She sank to her knees, the cold water lapping at her legs. It was no longer just a creature of the sea. It had become something more, a presence that transcended the physical world, reaching into the minds of those who dared seek it out. Evelyn realized then that she was not just dealing with a predator. She was facing a force that thrived on the darkest aspects of the human psyche. It was as if the shark was a mirror, reflecting the inner turmoil and fear of those it haunted. She returned to her cottage, soaked and shivering, her mind teetering on the edge of collapse. She needed to find a way to confront it, to face the darkness head-on, or it would consume her entirely. But how do you fight something that is both real and spectral? A creature of flesh and shadow that moves between worlds. The answer eluded her, slipping away like grains of sand through her fingers. As she stared at the storm-tossed sea outside her window, a resolve hardened within her. The ghost shark had chosen her for a reason. It was not just a hunter, it was a harbinger. She would go to it, face it in its domain, and uncover the truth of its existence, no matter the cost. The line between hunter and hunted had blurred. She was no longer merely a researcher seeking knowledge. She had become part of the legend, bound to the ghost shark by the shared darkness that now festered in her soul. And so Evelyn prepared for her descent into the abyss, knowing that whatever lay beneath the waters of Blackwater Bay was more than just a monster. It was a manifestation of the sea's ancient wrath, a reflection of the darkness within humanity itself, and it was waiting for her. The morning they set sail was cloaked in an unnatural stillness, the sky heavy with the threat of an unseen storm. Evelyn stood at the dock, her face a mask of grim determination. She was joined by Sam and Father Donnelly, the only two who had agreed to accompany her on this final journey into the heart of the legend. Sam was a young fisherman with wild eyes and a permanent scowl, hardened by the loss of his brother to the sea. Father Donnelly, on the other hand, was the town's spiritual anchor, a man whose faith was now tested by something far beyond his understanding. They were an unlikely trio, united by a shared resolve to confront the darkness that had swallowed their town whole. The townspeople watched in silence as the boat pulled away from the dock, a collective shiver passing through the crowd. No one expected them to return. Blackwater Bay had already claimed too many lives, and now it seemed intent on claiming more. The boat moved steadily towards the coordinates Evelyn had deciphered from the ancient texts, towards the cursed reef known as the Abyssal Grave. It was said to be the ghost shark's lair, a place where the veil between the living and the supernatural was at its thinnest. As they sailed further from the shore, the landscape of the bay transformed. The waters grew darker, taking on a greenish hue that deepened to black as they neared the reef. The sea, usually so full of life, was eerily calm, the surface a slick, oily mirror reflecting the heavy sky above. It was as if they were sailing into another realm where the natural laws no longer applied. A thick fog began to roll in, swallowing the horizon and shrouding them in an oppressive gray. Evelyn felt the weight of it pressing down on her chest, a cold hand that squeezed the air from her lungs. Hours passed in silence. They spoke little, each man lost in his own thoughts. Sam gripped his harpoon tightly, his knuckles white against the wood, his eyes scanning the water for any sign of movement. Father Donnelly sat towards the stern, clutching his rosary beads, his lips moving in silent prayer. Evelyn busied herself with the equipment she had brought, a submersible camera, sonar devices, anything that might help them see into the depths below. But she knew deep down that technology would be of little use here. They were not dealing with a creature that could be understood by scientific means alone. Finally, they arrived at the coordinates. The sea around them was a void, blacker than any night, as if light itself was swallowed by the abyss. The fog thickened, reducing their visibility to mere feet. Evelyn lowered the submersible camera into the water, the live feed flickering to life on the monitor. At first, there was nothing but darkness, the screen a canvas of black static. Then, slowly, shapes began to emerge, rock formations twisted and jagged, like the ribcage of a long-dead leviathan. The tension on the boat was palpable. They watched the monitor with bated breath as the camera descended further into the abyss. A faint current tugged at it, causing the view to sway, revealing glimpses of what lay hidden in the depths. Evelyn's heart raced as the camera passed over something that gleamed faintly in the darkness. A field of scattered bones, bleached and broken, remnants of creatures that had ventured too close to the ghost shark's domain. Suddenly, the monitor flickered, and the water around the camera darkened as if a shadow had passed over it. The shadow grew, taking on a shape that sent a jolt of fear through them all. It moved with an unsettling grace, gliding silently through the water, too massive to be any ordinary shark. Evelyn's breath caught in her throat. It was the ghost shark. Even through the grainy feed, they could see its form, pale and spectral, its skin a translucent membrane stretched over a skeletal frame. Its eyes were hollow pits, empty voids that seemed to pierce through the screen and into their very souls. The shark circled the camera, its movements slow and deliberate, as if studying the intruders in its domain. Evelyn felt a wave of nausea as its gaze seemed to settle on her, a cold, invasive presence that brushed against the edges of her consciousness. Then, without warning, the camera feed cut out, the screen going black. The boat rocked violently, as if struck by an unseen force. Sam shouted, grabbing his harpoon as they peered over the edge into the abyss. There was nothing, only the vast, dark sea stretching out beneath them. But they could feel it. The ghost shark was there, just below the surface, waiting. It was no longer content to remain a shadow. It had come for them. "We need to go," Sam hissed, his voice trembling. "This is madness. We can't fight this thing." But Evelyn knew there was no turning back. She had come too far, and the ghost shark had drawn them into its lair for a reason. It was time to face it, to confront the darkness that had haunted the town for centuries. "It's not just a creature," she said, her voice eerily calm. "It's a guardian, a manifestation of the bay's darkest secrets. And it's bound to this place until someone ends the cycle." Father Donnelly stepped forward, his eyes hard with resolve. "If it's a demon, it can be exorcised," he declared, raising his cross to the sea. "We face it, not with fear, but with faith." Evelyn wasn't sure if faith was what they needed, but they had little else to rely on. She moved to the edge of the boat, staring into the murky depths. For a moment, everything was still. Then the water began to churn, a violent whirlpool forming around the boat. It was as if the sea itself was opening its maw to swallow them whole. Without hesitation, Evelyn dived into the water. Cold engulfed her immediately, a numbing embrace that stole her breath. She opened her eyes to see the ghost shark before her, its massive form materializing from the darkness. It moved towards her, its jaws parting to reveal rows of razor-sharp teeth. But in that moment, Evelyn felt no fear. Instead, she felt a strange sense of understanding, a twisted empathy with the creature that had become a legend of death and despair. The shark loomed closer, and she reached out, her fingers brushing against its translucent skin. A rush of images flooded her mind, visions of the town's past, the countless sacrifices made to appease this ancient force. She saw the faces of the lost, their eyes hollow, pleading for release. The ghost shark was not merely a beast, it was the embodiment of the bay's anguish, a vessel for the collective guilt and fear of its people. It was both the hunter and the hunted, bound to the abyssal grave by the darkness of the human soul. Above the water, Sam and Father Donnelly watched in horror as Evelyn disappeared beneath the surface. Sam moved to dive in after her, but Father Donnelly held him back, shaking his head. "It's her choice," he whispered. "We cannot intervene." Underwater, Evelyn felt herself being drawn into the shark's mind, into the core of its existence. She realized that the only way to break the cycle was to confront the very darkness that had given birth to it. She let the shark pull her deeper into the abyss where the light of the surface could no longer reach. It was there, in the depths of the abyssal grave, that she saw it, the source of the curse, a pulsating heart of darkness, a vortex of energy that resonated with the hatred and sorrow of generations. The shark circled the vortex, its form flickering between flesh and shadow. Evelyn understood now. The ghost shark was the guardian of this place, bound to contain the darkness so it would not spread. It was not the enemy, it was the key. With her last ounce of strength, Evelyn swam towards the vortex, feeling the weight of the bay's history pressing down on her. She reached into the darkness, letting it envelop her. The shark moved with her, merging into the shadows until they were one, a union of the living and the spectral. Above, on the boat, the sea erupted in a violent surge. The fog lifted and the waters calmed. Sam and Father Donnelly stared into the churning depths, but Evelyn did not resurface. The water stilled, and a profound silence settled over the bay. They knew then that the ghost shark had been appeased for now. The curse was lifted, but the cost was Evelyn's sacrifice. She had become part of the legend, a guardian of the abyssal grave. As the boat made its way back to shore, the weight of what had transpired hung heavy in the air. The town would live on, but it would never be free of the ghostly presence that haunted its waters. For the ghost shark was not dead. It had simply returned to the abyss, taking with it the one who had dared to face it. Evelyn was now part of the sea's dark lore, bound to the depths where the line between the living and the supernatural blurred. Blackwater Bay would never forget her, nor the shadows that lingered just below its surface. The ghost shark had returned to its lair, and with it, the knowledge that it could rise again, summoned by the darkness in human hearts. And somewhere, deep in the cold embrace of the abyssal grave, Evelyn's spirit swam beside the spectral guardian, watching, waiting for the next cycle to begin. The sea was still again. Blackwater Bay lay quiet under a pallid sky, the waters reflecting a pale, ghostly light that made the town seem as if it floated on the edge of reality. Weeks had passed since that fateful journey to the abyssal grave, but for the people of Blackwater Bay, time had lost its meaning. The fog had lifted, the tides returned to their natural rhythm, and the fishermen dared once more to cast their nets into the sea. But the town knew in its bones that the cost of this fragile peace had been steep. They never spoke of Evelyn Harris. Her name was whispered like a prayer, a cautionary tale to those who sought to understand the mysteries of the deep. To many, she had become a martyr, a soul lost to the bay's ancient hunger. Yet there were those who believed she was still out there, in the murky depths, a part of the darkness she had sought to vanquish. The sea, they said, had taken her, and in return it had given them back their lives. Sam was not one of those people. He couldn't forget the sight of Evelyn disappearing into the abyss, the water closing over her as if swallowing her whole. He had felt a profound emptiness since that day, a gnawing void that words could not fill. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw her face, not in fear or horror, but in acceptance. She had gone to the ghost shark willingly, as if answering a call that none of them could hear. And now the sea was quiet. Too quiet. Father Donnelly had tried to console him, to assure him that Evelyn's sacrifice had brought an end to the curse. "The bay is at peace now," he had said, placing a hand on Sam's shoulder. But Sam could see the doubt in the old priest's eyes, the lingering fear that the sea's reprieve was only temporary. He could sense it too in the way the townspeople moved, how they still avoided the water's edge at dusk, and how they spoke in hushed tones about the things that moved in the deep. It was on one of these somber mornings that the truth began to reveal itself. Sam had taken to walking the shoreline at dawn, a ritual that brought him little comfort, but at least gave him purpose. The mist hung low over the water, casting a dreamlike haze over the beach. As he walked, his eyes caught something glinting among the rocks. He approached cautiously, heart pounding in his chest. It was Evelyn's locket, the one she always wore. Sam's hand shook as he picked it up, the metal cold against his skin. He opened it slowly, finding inside the photograph of her parents, the edges warped from the salt water. How had it come to rest here, washed ashore so near the town? He glanced out at the sea, the vast, unfeeling expanse that seemed to watch him with 1,000 invisible eyes. In that moment, he felt a surge of anger, a raw, unfiltered rage at the sea that had taken so much and given back only silence. That night, the nightmares returned. Sam dreamt of the abyssal grave, of the darkness that roiled within its depths. He saw Evelyn there, not as a victim, but as something more. Changed, her eyes reflecting the abyss that had consumed her. She moved with the ghost shark, their forms intertwined in a dance of shadows and light, guardian and prisoner bound by an unbreakable pact. The sea whispered to him, its voice a low, mournful wail that spoke of ancient sorrows and unending hunger. He awoke with a start, drenched in sweat, the echo of the sea's voice still ringing in his ears. He knew then that it wasn't over. The ghost shark had not been vanquished, it had merely changed. Evelyn had become part of it, and through her the darkness remained, a living wound beneath the waters of Blackwater Bay. Driven by a sense of urgency, Sam sought out Father Donnelly. He found him at the church, kneeling before the altar, his face drawn and weary. The priest listened as Sam recounted his dreams, his eyes darkening with each word. When Sam showed him the locket, Father Donnelly paled, his hands trembling as he took it. "This," the priest whispered, "is a sign. Evelyn is still with us, but not as we knew her. The sea, it has changed her. She is part of it now." Sam felt a cold dread settle over him. "What does that mean?" he demanded, his voice rising. Is she the ghost shark?" Father Donnelly closed his eyes, the weight of his years pressing down on him. "No, she is not the shark, but she is bound to it. She sought to understand the darkness, and in doing so she became part of it. The ghost shark is not just a creature, it is a force, an embodiment of the bay's sorrow and wrath. Evelyn, she carries that within her now." The realization hit Sam like a blow. Evelyn had not ended the curse. She had merely taken it into herself. The bay was at peace not because the ghost shark was gone, but because Evelyn had become its vessel, a new guardian for the darkness that lay in wait. The sea was calm because it had found a new balance, one that teetered on the edge of human suffering and supernatural wrath. The following days were marked by a tense, uneasy calm. The townspeople sensed a change but could not name it. They continued their lives, fishing, mending nets, and whispering prayers to the sea, but the fear lingered just beneath the surface. They avoided the water at night, sensing that something had shifted in the bay's depths, something that watched and waited. Sam took to the cliffs where Evelyn had once stood, staring out at the horizon. He felt her presence there, a faint whisper on the wind, a shadow that moved in the corner of his eye. It was on one such evening as the sun dipped below the horizon that he saw it, the spectral form of the ghost shark, gliding silently beneath the waves, its eyes glowing faintly in the twilight. But this time he did not feel the raw terror that had gripped him before. Instead, he felt a profound sadness, a deep, aching sorrow that resonated with the heartbeat of the sea. The shark surfaced briefly, its translucent form shimmering in the dying light. Sam held his breath, his heart aching as he met its gaze. For a brief, impossible moment, he saw Evelyn in its eyes. Not as a monster, but as a guardian, a soul bound to the darkness yet fighting to contain it. She had become the bay's protector, not through violence, but through sacrifice. And in that sacrifice, she had found a twisted form of peace. The shark sank back into the depths, leaving the water still once more. Sam exhaled, a tear slipping down his cheek. He understood now. The ghost shark was not a curse to be broken, but a cycle to be endured. It was a reminder of the darkness that dwelled within and without, a guardian of the balance between the living and the spectral. Evelyn had not been consumed by the darkness. She had embraced it, becoming one with the very force that the town feared. Blackwater Bay would live on, its people continuing their fragile existence on the edge of the abyss. The legend of the ghost shark would fade into whispers and shadows, a story told in hushed voices to ward off the darkness. But for those who had seen, who had truly understood, the sea would never be the same. They would always know that somewhere beneath the still waters, Evelyn watched over them, a part of the sea's endless mournful song. And as the tide ebbed and flowed, the bay breathed a sigh, an ancient rhythm that echoed the heartbeat of its guardian. The ghost shark had found its peace for now, but the sea was ever watchful, ever hungry. For in the depths of the abyssal grave, the darkness stirred, waiting for the day when it would rise again. Sam turned away from the cliffs. The image of Evelyn's eyes burned into his memory. He walked back to the town, to life, to the light, knowing that he carried a piece of the abyss within him. They all did. It was the price of living on the edge of the world, where the line between the natural and the supernatural was as thin as a breath, as fleeting as a whisper. The sea was quiet once more, but in that quiet, a promise lingered. The ghost shark had been unveiled, its truth laid bare. And somewhere in the deep, Evelyn swam beside it, the eternal guardian of Blackwater Bay, bound to the darkness she had sought to understand. The water was still. The legend lived on.